Okay, let's check the audio. I can see the visuals working. Can y'all hear me? Awesome. A post of yours got censored, Julie? That's hilarious. I had one censored on me yesterday on Twitter or X because I was actually quoting one of these idiots in a quote of them subjugating um, blacks to the colonial powers and literally just cut and pasted a quote, and Twitter immediately, I mean, like in seconds, um, censored it. And then when I wrote what I was doing and I was trying to tell them that I was actually criticizing the people that wrote it, and then I heard an email back saying, "Oh, okay, we unflagged it." Ridiculous. All right, we're going to go ahead and start. We're only going to do one. Hello. We're only going to do one chapter today. It's a critical chapter in trying to put the pieces together of who's, how long this has been going on and who's all involved. But we have a guest who's been staying with us the last several months going to school down here from friends in Minnesota. And yesterday, her Sunday, her mom flew in from Minnesota with some of her best friends, and they rented a Airbnb because they're not all going to fit in my house. And yesterday was her 21st birthday, so we're throwing a big birthday party for her and her family and friends that are here from Minnesota. So I don't have as much time today, and so we're just going to do the one chapter. And I did want to add a couple of notes from yesterday from chapter one. Um, we talked about the Midford girls and how intricately involved in the whole international fascism they were. Like Unity was a lover of Hitler, Diane was married to the Oswald Mosley, who is the mastermind of fascism in England. And what I left out yesterday is that Diane Mitford is also first cousins with Clementine Churchill, who was Winston Churchill's wife. So the group that they associated with, so that makes Randolph Churchill, Churchill's son, who is a fascist, cousins with the Mitford kids, who themselves are all fascist. So I just want everybody to understand how tight knit that group is. Um, excuse me. All right. So carrying on. Albert Speer, who was the Minister of Armaments in the war production in the Nazi machine and very close to Hitler, is using the relationship that Hitler had with Unity to basically create propaganda. He would leak things to her, and she would then, like almost as a secret, tell other people. So she was very much a part of the war machine, whether she knew it or not. When Mosley and Diana married, Goebbels, Goebbels, maniacally evil man, and his wife were part of the ceremony. And it was held in Germany. And guess who their guest of honor was? Hitler. So you have to understand that when Oswald Mosley is spouting fascism in England, he has both the ear of Churchill, who 100% was a closet fascist, and he also had the ear of Hitler. So the moving on. The League of Nations was not intended as a grouping of all nations. It was basically the impetus or the birthing process for creating a European Union. That's what Mosley envisioned it as. They wanted to carve up all the world's resources by the fascist powers and put them into groups. And you're going to hear that in chapter 2 mimicked by a new guy. So, and a very influential guy in the birth of the European Union. So, Germany was going to be one entity leading what they refer to as the pan-European effort, and Britain was the other pillar that was going to deliver the British Empire, which kind of touched everything because they have at this point still all in all the different geographical regions of the world. So they were going to leave Britain as a fascist entity, and as another fascist entity. And these at originally was 6. It'll get narrowed down to 4, but the 6 entities are basically going to come together all under a fascist infrastructure that they will be building out and create the New World Order. That's how they're going to deliver fascism, because fascism is the only way you can deliver New World Order. And that's what everybody needs to understand. You can't deliver free people into a prison structure without force, which is why it has to be done under a fascist infrastructure. And all along, this maniacal plan is to create these entities that's going to be able to deliver that. It was during this time that Neville Chamberlain was elected prime minister in 1939. Chamberlain was announced that Britain was officially at war with Germany. It was not until Germany invaded France that, even though he said about a year before that, he did nothing but make the declaration. It wasn't until Germany invaded France that, and this is World War I, that British actually got involved in, World War II, in the actual warfare. And there was a thing that happened. It was called the Britain-Munich betrayal, because unbeknownst to most people, Britain had made a secret agreement with Germany that had been worked out through these back channel Oswald Mosley kind of pipelines. But once I don't think Britain believed that they were going to invade France, but once they did that, that deal was kind of off. So you have the guy that was King Henry VIII, who abdicated his throne. He is now referred to as the Duke of Windsor. And he also is very pro-fascist and pro-Hitler. He's forbidden to go to the front of the war because they don't want him talking to the military and influencing them. Because, as always, the royalty in Britain has the respect of some people. So the powers to be in England had decided it was not a good idea for him to go to the front, but he decided to work around them and visit the front anyway. And he did, in fact, have multiple conversations with the generals, one of which was referred to as Ironside. And he did try to create propaganda to disenfranchise the British soldiers from fighting. Um, Also wanted to mention another club I come across. It was called the Right Club, which was another group of fascists in the British establishment that was formed just prior to World War II. And the MI5, which is the British version of the FBI, had already identified that as basically a fifth column of propagandists that were going to work against British working with the Allies. So a little over 3 years later, excuse me, Neville, goodness, Neville Chamberlain resigns and Churchill becomes the prime minister. At this point, he appears on the outside to have switched teams and is now going to work in partnership with Roosevelt. But I have a completely different opinion of this. I think, and the author does make note that it appears that Churchill basically changed tactics, which is what I think happened in World War II overall. Churchill decided because Roosevelt can't overtly adopt fascism. He'd have been impeached. So they both have to slow roll this whole thing. So it appears on the surface that Churchill changed tactics and went for the long road of establishing the European Union and not an overtly fascist revolution like is mostly done. So he arrests um, Oswald Mosley and his wife Diane Mosley. They spend a little bit of time in jail, and then basically is released on house arrest. So, in other words, and they did lock up some other like mid-level fascists, which we see throughout Operation Gladio everywhere. Um, the they will lock up the middle tier. They never lock up the top tier. So they go through the optics of arresting some of, but then turns right around and the MI5/FBI turns around and says, we did an investigation and we saw no fascist elements. Well, you just arrested the two leaders of it. So how can you say you didn't find anything? And they were involved in meetings and clubs, but what they found, but won't tell us, is that all of the upper echelon of the British government and groupings, all the lords and barons and all of that, are all involved in this fascist movement inside of England. So if they arrested one, the entire round table of Oxford, they would have had to arrest all of them. So they take the two guys that are Oswald Mosley and his wife, and arrest them, then immediately release them. So the whole thing is just propaganda. Churchill, in fact, all right, Mosley would be made the fall guy. So we're looking at just the optics. I want to get down to the next part. So Roosevelt's primary concern in all of this was that if Hitler was to do a land operation in British, knowing Churchill's actual thoughts of being a closet fascist himself, that he would not resist. And Roosevelt was very concerned because he hadn't brought America along at the same pace that Europe was going at, that the British fleet would then be used against America. And so he's getting very antsy at this point. And in walks a guy by the name of Franz Six, S-I-X. He was the individual selected by Hitler to oversee a ground invasion of the UK. He is also among the former Nazis installed into West Germany working with Galen after supposedly the denazified West Germany sets up. And he also works with the CIA after the end of World War II in some of the stay behind network installation. So you can start seeing at this point, now that Churchill is going to change tactics to the long game, instead of using words like international fascism, they begin using a word called pan-Europeanism or pan-Europe. And what's interesting about that is that's the exact same word that was used in the Third Way, pan-European. And there's going to be 6 of these pan entities that will then all fold in to create the New World Order. So there's no philosophical difference between those two terms, but you know that as soon as fascism got a bad name because of Hitler, which we will see, was not a welcomed entity. He's kind of like the bull in the china shop. It's not that they disagreed with any of his philosophies, because they did not. They just felt he was the bull in the china shop, and they would not be able to stealthily mold everybody into their propaganda apparatus with Hitler in charge of Germany. So also is pointed out that it immediately upon the winning of World War II, they didn't even sit down to tea before they're immediately, and in some cases prior to, they're focusing already on their next enemy in their forever war machine, and that becomes the Soviet communists, which they were just fighting with as far as the Allies are concerned. So my philosophy, y'all all know, is that the shift in focus to communist was a tactic in the overall war to implement the New World Order, perpetual war machine, chaos, to herd everybody into fascism and the New World Order. You can't herd people, you can't scare people without a boogeyman. The Soviet communism became the next boogeyman after Hitler. And the shift was almost immediate. So they're going to spend some time demonizing communism in order to get us all into the fascism. All of the countries that seemed to be indifferent to the invasion of the Nazis were now the ones screaming the loudest about the communist potential invasion. Mosley would write, quote, "We must return to the fundamental concepts of a European nation which animated the war generation of 1918. So in 1943, this intensifies the overall Europeanism feel and the New World Order, because they are now saying they're the last line of defense. Even Mussolini was bored with the concept of a European community. His only caveat was he thought it needed to be headed out of Rome, because Mussolini, being a Catholic, and you're also going to see another correlation to Catholicism here in a minute, felt that because it was reasons and needed, that's really his only difference. But one of the most troubling things is every single one of these guys, Churchill, Mussolini, Hitler, all of them, they believed in their pan division of six entities. Neither Arabs nor Africans were ever in a grouping. They were always intended to be slaves. With European overlords. And you can see that through the whole colonization of Africa at that time, but they never intended to free Africa. And we'll have some quotes. It's really, I mean, it's so disgusting. And for them now to constantly, in the name of fascism and trying to destroy America, call us the racist, I don't know of any leader in America, maybe Johnson or even Woodrow Wilson would have, but did we ever say that we were going to keep in perpetuity African countries, the entire countries, enslaved to feed our needs of natural resources? But European leaders did throughout this time. So before the end of World War II, the Nazis would include Franz Six, who was also advocating for the new European Conference, i.e., Atlantic Charter, EU, and NATO. The same guy that had planned the invasion of Britain would be writing about the unification in the post-war new setup, if you will. But he very much did not want Britain to be a separate entity. He wanted them part of a pan-European entity. Okay. So that kind of gets us back to where I wanted to kind of start today. I was trying to see if I thought there was one other guy that I did a little bit more research on. So the whole transition of the refocusing their new war against the communists was a speech that Churchill gave in the United States where he first mentioned the words Iron Curtain. And that very much about psychological warfare. That very much kind of was the stake in the ground that transitioned the focus, at least for America. All right. Mosley would be at the forefront of these post World War II paramilitary fascist cells. So Mosley was very much involved in the whole idea of gladio units inside of the British government, and one of the guys that worked for Galen in the concept of gladio units was Otto Skorzeny. It's Skorzeny. In 1951, fascism neo-Nazi groups across Europe assembled in Sweden to found a new international movement affiliated with the Malmo International, and was a secretariat that was set up in Rome after their initial meeting in Sweden. Now, that obviously makes sense from what we know about the gladio units from our last book, because Rome was overran with them. I mean, there were so many gladio units in Italy, it wasn't even funny. So to know now, because this part was not in our other book, that there was actually an international, it's MALMO International, that was set up basically as part of the governance structure of Operation Gladio. Activists tried to establish national branches in all of the different countries as part of a pan European umbrella movement. The New York Times claimed that one of their main objectives was to penetrate the United States and British democratic organizations by taking advantage of the rise in anti communism. But as we know, the British government was already penetrated because they're part of the whole organization to make it up. Contacts were established with 40 extremist organizations in Europe, in Arab countries, Argentina. Europe, as a coordinating body, had 20 such neo Nazi groups that were under the leadership of the guy we talked about yesterday, the Hans Ulrich Rudel, Rudel, the guy that, and for those of you that were not with us yesterday, Rudel is a horrible, horrible Nazi guy who escapes Germany, goes to Argentina, is an arms dealer in South America during all of the revolutions down there. And the United States government, the Department of Defense, invites this guy because he's like the most decorated attack fighter pilot in all of Germany's Air Force during World War II. We invited him into the United States in consultation for creating the A-10. We did that. So you just can't make this crap up. Also, these guys, all of the travel for this neo-Nazi circuit, the Agenter Press, which we learned about in our former book, was located in Portugal as part of the Stay Behind Gladio. They under their umbrella, they had a travel agent, and that entity is who arranged all of this travel for all of these fascists, the underground movements of these leaders, like the guy we talked about from France, that Yves Surratt. So that's how they all got around so easy without getting caught. Because Agenter Press, as we found out, was also into forgeries. So they forged their passports. They made up new identities for them. It's always handy if you're going to be a criminal to have a press that is really good at forgeries. So, all right. Now, chapter 2. We meet a very interesting guy in chapter 2. His name is Count Richard von, again, these names just kill me. Klaudenhove, it's Coundenhove, Kalergi, Kalergi. So I'm going to call him Richard. He's an intellectual. He is regarded as, today, he is regarded as the spiritual grandfather of the European Union. That's all this guy does his entire life, is advocate across the entire world for a European Union. And he is also one of the founders of the 6 segments, delving into creating the New World Order. So he was not alive for its actual founding in 1993, but he is definitely the leading advocate for it his entire life. Okay. You can say that his entire life was literally a crusade, and that's going to be important in a minute. You'll see that. His father was a Jesuit-trained Austria-Hungarian diplomat who spoke 18 languages. And he also represented the Austria-Hungarian kingdom as their diplomatic representative in many different places. While he was stationed in Japan, he married a samurai's daughter, and in doing so, resulted in her being disinherited. That's kind of a funny aside because Richard would later marry a Jewish actress, and his mom disinherited him. Irony. So, Richard's dad grew up in a very anti Semitic home, and it is said that he had an epiphany while doing a research paper when he became a supporter of Zionism, and there's some caveats here that we'll get to, in the establishment of a home for Jewish people, but not like you and I have ever believed Israel was set up. They had some very unique ideas on why it should be set up, and these are the people that set it up, which is why it's very important. But we're never going to know all of his actual thoughts because Richard's dad, because when he died, he told his servant to burn all 40 volumes of his diary. So we don't really have any idea about other than what he wrote publicly, and there is quite a bit of that as well. The author makes much of the fact that Richard was educated in a very strict Catholic. He went to Catholic boarding schools in Austria. He also wrote about extensive parallels between the Christian Crusades and his ideas as it related to Europe. He even adopted the Christian Crusader flag as his pan-European flag. All he did, you remember the Crusaders flag had the cross? All he did was put stars for the countries around the outside of the cross. His words on the subject included, quote, "After the fall of the Roman Empire, the Crusades represented the most vigorous display of European solidarity for a time. No feuds between kings, princes, and cities emerged to a common cause. The League would have two objectives. First, to ensure permanent peace within the Christian world, and secondly, to rally the arm and to rally the strength of Europe for the reconquest of the Holy Land in the Mediterranean." He went on to write, finally, in 1834, Mazzini, M-A-Z-Z-I-N-I, founded an entity called Young Europe, a movement designed to coordinate all existing revolutionary movements with a view to building a new united Europe on a basis of nationalism and democracy. Richard envisioned his pan-European idea to mirror the 1834 attempts to create a united Europe. Nothing new under the sun. Noticing that the pan-European idea of the Crusades end was Richard's idea, an all-encompassing conquering of the Holy Land as part of the Christian movement, not necessarily part of Jewish's restoration movement. Because actually, he wanted to put them in Africa. Also important to note is the reference to nationalism and democracy, as if the nationalism term equated to democracy. Because it doesn't for these people, because they're fascist. Approach to government is very much like the current day Britain, where his approach was he still wanted to keep the monarchy in the British part of it and have him as a figurehead, but then have an administrator, like a prime minister, to be the fascist dictator. Richard would hold, and the reason, let me just say this too, the reason he felt that was important is because youth, in their opinion, were very amenable at the time, kind of like they are today, to fascist dictators. And he felt in order to have the unity, you had to have the fascist dictator for the youth element, and you had to have the king, the monarch, for the older elements so they didn't get disenfranchised with just getting bossed around. Richard would hold many meetings with Mussolini on the subject of pan European, and Mussolini was a very huge fan of this concept. The only caveat, as I mentioned before, was that he wanted it in Rome because that's where the Christian Crusades originated out of. Catholicism and the head of the old world, he felt, belonged in Rome. When Richard was still young, his parents had a guy by the name of Abdullah Mahmum Sahrawarthy, Suhraworthy, who lived with them for 6 months while he was going to school in England. And Richard's dad, it encouraged him to be the founder of a pan-Islamic society, and he would go back to India, and some of his relatives, and he did try to create it. He was eventually knighted by the British Empire for his attempts. One of his relatives would go on to be the Prime Minister of Pakistan, and also one of his relatives was the Prime Minister of Bengal, Bengal, in the 1940s. However, the relative that was in charge of Bengal was also referred to as the Butcher of Bengali. So he wasn't a good guy. Maybe a little too much on the fascism side. And just so that everybody knows, from our previous book, we know that the pan-Islamic eventually did become a thing, but it was given to Turkey, which is the whole reason Turkey is in NATO. Because for those of you that are new, I scratched my head having been on NATO deployments. I was actually stationed in Italy, very familiar with NATO and how it operates. It always struck me as odd. And when I then transferred, I was at U.S. Central Command that had the jurisdiction for all of the basically Middle East. I just thought it was odd that Turkey's a Muslim country and not in our AOR. I'm like, what explains that? And all of this digging has turned up what is so apparent to me now, knowing about the whole Gladio units and the structure and this pan sectioning of the earth, is that Turkey is the entity that was basically put in charge under NATO to deliver to them all of the Islamic countries, to include Gladio units of terror units, which we're seeing today, like Hamas and Hezbollah. That's all. Turkey's behind all of it. They throw out Iran, but all of the Muslim Brotherhood, ISIS, all of them were seeded out of the Muslim terror units in Turkey. Today, they initially tried to use Egypt. Galen used Egypt as one of their rat lines to get the Nazis out of Germany into Argentina, and they worked extensively with the Muslim Brotherhood in setting that up in Egypt. But eventually they decide they're going to overthrow Egypt, and it gets kind of hairy, and all that responsibility then shifts to Turkey. Also, I'm going to put this in, it's not in the book, but I want y'all to understand the relevance of everything we're learning today. I did not know this, but out of Turkey's Gladio units, they trained and equipped Uyghurs, who are Muslims, and the property they sit on as part of China is where all of China's energy resources are, the oil wells, if you will. So there was a very long period of time when the Uyghurs were trained in Turkey in Gladio units to go create chaos in China so that they could actually set up a place called Turkestan. That's real. Look it up. Turkestan had a guy who claimed in a ceremony in Washington, D.C., to be the Turkestanish leader in exile and then went home to his house in Virginia. So they've been at this for a very long time, and all of it is very relevant today. So I'm just going to say everything that we hear about the Uyghurs is not necessarily true. Just saying. After World War I came to a conclusion, the aftermath resulted in many European thrones, over 20 of them. And this kind of hit me because when you start to, the only way you get fascism is breaking down culture. And just like we still see with the British throne, which by the way didn't get overthrown. Wow, weird. Because they've already agreed to be fascist. The people, the kingdoms that were loyal to their citizenry and to the culture of their kingdom all got eliminated as a result of World War One, and obviously just prior to that, like the Romanovs were killed off right before World War One. But the conclusion of World War One saw some of them over 1,000-year dynasties all gone, wiped off the map. This left a big void, and it is in that chaos and the breaking down of culture that fascism is allowed to thrive. That's why our culture in America is constantly under attack. The only way that they can get fascism shoved down people's throat is to destroy the country culturally, family, blah, blah, blah. Supposedly republics were put in their place, but it's my estimation that that's basically a holding block for the fascism, because if any of the people that were in charge of the temporary republics, if you will, got too big in their britches, they just couped them. The same thing happened with Charles de Gaulle in France. The guy that was originally in France was very much a fascist. And the Vichy government. But when Charles de Gaulle got elected, he very much believed in French culture, and he wasn't a fascist. They tried to kill him over 20 times. It is commonly understood that since the end of the religious wars, the dynasty rivalries, that supposedly peace was going to break out and everybody was going to live happily ever after. We know that that was not their end goal in doing this because, number one, it didn't happen. So a new holy alliance was to be created, but this new holy alliance against wars was to be the League of Nations and not of kings, a league for progress in democracy. The prophet of this League of Nations, this just made me laugh out loud, was to be the great President Woodrow Wilson. So all of you laugh with me, because we know that he was, if not, and I know what you say about Biden, Woodrow Wilson is the worst president we ever had, in my opinion. For those of you who needs a refresher, Woodrow Wilson is the guy that signed into law the Federal Reserve. And keep in mind that they needed Teddy Roosevelt to run as an independent in order for Wilson to even get elected. Because Howard Taft was running for re-election, and without Teddy Roosevelt, bastard, Howard Taft would have been re-elected. So this may go down as their first actual cheat. Wilson authorized the imposition, or basically segregation, in all federal bureaucracies that were not segregated before he became president. He ousted African Americans from federal post. He was in opposition to women's suffrage. His first term was largely devoted towards passing a progressive New Freedom domestic agenda, the first step to fascism. We already talked about the revenue He was the one that signed into law the income tax. Um, he also created the FTC. It was under his watch that World War I was started. And he ran initially on a we're not getting any foreign wars, but in his reelection campaign, he won by less than 600,000 votes across. It was an electoral victory by a lot, but the popular vote that the left likes to tout, he was he won by less than 600,000 for keeping us out of the war, and then immediately not only gets into World War I, but also gets into a fight with Mexico. Um, Europe viewed him as the man that was going to bring the United States into the League of Nations, which he did not do. Um, and he also issued 14 points, which, if you've never looked at them, I would encourage you at this point to do it. Um, and the Europe fascists believed that Woodrow Wilson was going to deliver the League of Nations being the foot in the door, if you will, to their six segment um, order. And I would argue that when we went into NAFTA, NAFTA was the delivering, because remember there are three caveats for these six entities is to have like common currency, um, common trade, and a common customs arrangement as far as the trade goes. So in many ways, NAFTA was just another piece in delivering us towards this new world order and to create the Western American, Pan American is what they refer to it as, entity. It was the League of Nations that was responsible for the Balfour Declaration that called for the homeland for the Jewish people. Oswald Mosley was one of the most prominent representatives for England to the League of Nations. The author of our book, Cynthia Chung, makes note that it should not be lost on the reader that the idea of Jewish national homeland does fit into a view of a segregated world, not desegregated. So they're definitely advocating for segregation, which is probably why they worshipped Woodrow Wilson. It will be discussed later that there are acceptable forms of mixing and there are unacceptable forms of mixing that could be solved by the solution of segregation, and in their words, voluntarily or involuntarily. Wilson oversaw unprecedented segregation. And I don't, y'all know this, but I was assigned to the Pentagon, and the way the bathrooms are configured there is totally weird. Um, and I was there over, I can't remember which anniversary of the, I was there in the 90s, so probably like the 40th anniversary, something like that, of the completion of the Pentagon. And they had all of these posters along the concourse down where you go down and eat and the flower shop is and everything. And they had segregated bathrooms in the Pentagon, which is why the configuration of the bathrooms are so weird. They basically have now turned what was originally designated as the bathroom for only blacks to be the women's bathroom. But even because you had to segregate the black bathroom into men and women's, so now when it's all just a women's bathroom, it looks totally stupid. But that was the reason why. And I was kind of floored by that because I had no idea. Okay, the League of Nations was in fact an imperialistic vision which would seat Anglo America at the helm of the New World Order. by one person's view. He agreed that sending the problematic, he being Richard, agreed that sending the problematic Jews to a homeland far removed from Europe so that they could be protected from further hatred and violence. This is not so different from the whole idea of Woodrow Wilson, because Woodrow Wilson actually told a black leader in the White House that the whole reason he basically segregated all of the government was for their own protection. Richard would write that it was his idea to have Geneva, Switzerland as the home of the League of Nations, in one day also the home of the European Union. So they all have different ideas of where the home needs to be, but not of the basic concept, which is the most important part of it. Richard would draft a plan that created 6 regional and autonomous units originally, but the overall goal is to fold them into the New World Order. Within the League of Nations, he wanted the British Commonwealth as one, the Soviet Union, that they basically just set up at the end of World War II, which is how all of them other things got given to the Soviets, a Pan-America, a Pan-European, and a combined, and a China and Japan. Notice that both the Arabian people and the African people didn't make the cut list. He was conflicted, as we just talked about earlier, about wanting the King of England being in charge, or the U.S. There was also a lot of controversy about whether Britain should be part of the Europe or part of their own empire. So this new league was not entirely absent of monarchy, nor did it end imperialism by leaving the British Empire intact. Basically, they just wanted a new world order, and they were going to do whatever they could to get it. Because everything they said they were eliminating, it didn't eliminate. When Mussolini was initially approached on this idea, other than the fact that he wanted the headquarters in Rome, as we talked about, he was very much on board. He also saw it as a chance to consolidate the European Union and squeeze Hitler out of the picture. Because when this originally was being talked about was in the early 1930s, and Mussolini saw Hitler as a threat to overall fascism because he was the bull in the china shop. And Mussolini originally did not have any issue with Jewish people integrating and living with everybody else. It was only towards the end, when he knew it was inevitable that he was going to get taken over by Hitler, that without giving up his own authority, he began observing a lot of that. So, when Richard came to talk to Mussolini initially, he did not even request to see the current pope, because at the time, the current pope was Pope Pius XI. And God bless him, literally. Pope Pius XI was basically a shit kicker. He told everybody what was on his mind. He didn't like any of this crap going on, and he was very vocal about it. He was not on board with fascism. But Pope Pius XII was, I'm not going to say he was pro-fascism. He was definitely not anti-fascism. He also was there when Rome started setting up their Gladio units. So he never spoke out once about fascism under Mussolini. He didn't speak out negatively when Hitler came to town. He didn't speak out against the annihilation of the Jewish people. Pope Pius XII. Not good. Okay. So, interestingly enough, Richard meets, every time he comes to talk to Mussolini, he talks to the top cardinal, who at the time, I forget what Pope Pius XII's real name is, but while he was meeting with Mussolini and Pope Pius XI was still in office, he was actually talking to Pope Pius XII, because the guy that he was talking to ends up being appointed the next pope. So I just thought that was interesting. The author says it's almost like he knew that he didn't even need to bother talking to Pope Pius the 11th, that by talking to Pope Pius the 12th, he was actually going to be talking to the Pope that mattered when his whole pan-European came to pass. So Richard is quoted as saying there is no reason for basically an anti-fascist attitude on the part of the Catholic Church. Um, and this is him criticizing Pope Pius the 11th, because he's saying that he's wrong in his anti-fascist attitude, because Richard, being a Roman Catholic, likens the Catholic Church to fascism. He says Catholicism is the fascist form of Christianity, and Calvinism represents the democratic wing of Christianity. He likens it to the fascist party in that a priesthood is kind of like the dictator for an undemocratic minority to rule in a hierarchy. So Richard, as a Catholic, saw nothing wrong between Catholicism and fascism. He viewed them as one and the same. He was going to say that Catholic nations, or he did say that Catholic nations basically follow a fascist doctrine, because you have the one leader, and like in Cyprus, the Catholic bishop was the leader, and that basically he runs his country as a fascist dictatorship because he's in charge. And I guess you can kind of see that. I had never thought about that. But who you can argue with? If you're a Catholic and you're living in a Catholic country ran by a Catholic, I'm not going to use the word dictator, priest or archbishop, who are you going to go argue with? Who are you going to go to if he excommunicates you, you don't have a choice. You're just excommunicated. So it is kind of like a dictatorship. He goes on to say, it is obvious that the Catholic Church would be preferential to a fascist, where a Christian church would be preferential to a democratic system. And when the Catholic Church is in a minority within a nation, she depends on tolerance and therefore will embrace the democratic system because it suits their needs. This is him talking. For a Catholic nation, she seems to prefer a system of moderate fascism. And his example was Portugal, which was fascist at the time, and Austria, which also was fascist at the time. Democracy lays stress on, it stresses personal conscience. Fascism stresses authority and obedience, which again, you can kind of see his logic. This may explain why democracy was a success among Protestant populations and a failure among Catholic nations. Richard does not view the compatibility between the Catholic religion and fascism to be a criticism. That's the bottom line. It would be the leaders in Austria that would shape Hitler's view on anti-Semitism while he was incarcerated there. So most of you probably already know that Hitler basically was part of a coup before he ever even moved on to Germany in Austria. And he was put in jail as a result of that, and it is in jail that he wrote Mein Kampf. Richard saw no problem in dealing with the nationalistic tendencies of Germany and believed it fit inside his pan-European idea. He just viewed Hitler as a fanatic and therefore was not willing to compromise and fit Hitler's Germany within his pan-European model. But he definitely wanted Germany in it. After having worked for years with France to gain support for a fascist pan-European model, France went and elected a conservative by the name of Leon Blum, which totally threw a wrench in their whole united embracing of fascism in Europe. And that was probably the last time we ever had a fair election because it totally screwed up their plan. Richard's perspective is that there would be a fascist pan-European rule. It was just a matter of how to get there and whether it was going to be done peacefully or through force. And again, I'm explaining all this to you guys because I want you to understand the impetus and the mindset of these people, that they have a goal. When we look at the Gladio operations, which we're getting to, and the violence and the terrorism that it spawned, literally from immediately after World War II to today, they don't give a crap. Their goal is fascism, and they're going to drag every single country in the world into their new world order. And they already view that 75% of us are useless oxygen consumers, and they don't care how many of us have to die to get there. And that's the point we peace-loving Americans need to get into our brains. There's nothing we can put past them. Richard viewed forcing fascism to be unfortunate, but you have a choice. You can accept it peacefully. Once it was clear that there would not be a pan-European prior to World War II, Mussolini then began embracing, as I said earlier, Nazis' racial policies. So, and I think he only did that to try to keep Nazi Germany from invading Italy, which it didn't work in the end. Because in the end, Italy ended up with concentration camps. At least one of them was an extermination camp. Working through Richard's father's works that was labeled Anti-Semitism Throughout the Ages, that was the name of it. He's quoted as saying, the best definition of the Jew still remains that of a nation. That what are the Jews in reality? They are an artificial nation, a compound of numerous nationalities brought about by a common religion, formed both by a voluntary and a forced separation from other nations, and by the prohibition of mixed marriages, all of which has been the result of religious principles. This is his definition in his writing, and this is Richard's dad writing again, the guy that spoke like 18 languages. It was his view that Zionism is the inevitable result of anti-Semitism. Both phenomenons arise from the same root and have the same nature, being the only different in an expression for the same thing. So he equates anti-Semitism and Zionism as basically the same thing. He also says how, as is the case with the Jewish question, oppositions cannot be reconciled. Where there is hatred and aversion, in spite of all attempts, are continually increasing, their separation is best for all parties. Sounds just like the way they want to deal with the blacks. This separation, the Zionist movement, which literally is the separation and the forming of their own nation, intends to bring about the aim of the Zionist movement, which has now spread among the Jews all over the world, is to make it possible for Jews in all countries to immigrate and form a united nation in the Jewish state of Palestine. This is the one and only radical remedy possible for the current time. Once a country has been found and all of the Jews have been proclaimed citizens of that country, then indeed they will be alien and strangers among us. Jews, excuse me, are one of the most highly gifted and talented nations in the world. The expelling state is the greatest loser. When the hospitable state, which offers shelter to the exiles, derives the benefit. He made a notable distinction between Reform Jews and Orthodox Jews. He also said that it is not possible for both Jews and Christians to live harmoniously together, at least not with a large prevalence of, of non-reformed Jews, or unreformed, sorry, defined by him as Jews who refuse to assimilate into a Western Christian civilization. So, if you're going to be a pious Jew, that means that you're not a reformed Jew and that you have to be segregated. He goes on to say that Christians should the Christian states should at least make an attempt to derive profit from this basket of intellectual gifts called the Jewish state, because they're the ones that educated the Jews before they migrated. You just can't make this shit up. And that's when he then saw the similarities between the Africans that are going to have to stay separate, and that so you're going to have a separate Jewish state that provides intellectual property to their overlords, and you're going to have an African separation that is going to provide the labor and the resources within the continent of Africa to their overlords. And I guess the Islamic people at that time was just out to lunch, because he doesn't even talk about them. So Richard says the Balfour Declaration in the creation of the Jewish national homeland in Palestine, the Zionist idea in and of itself is still right and consistent, but the choice of Palestine as the new home was dictated by romance rather than by reason. This is Richard talking. There is a danger of the Jewish exodus to Palestine sharing one day the same fate as the Christian predecessors, as in the Crusaders, and the conflict or strength of the Arabic world on Syrian soil proving much stronger than all of the people in the Western world. A clash between the Zionist and the pan whatever idea is going to be threatening. So he's already saying that the Arab world is not going to take kindly to you plopping a Jewish state inside of their territory. What Richard is describing is the predictable outcome, almost as if it's what they were trying to bring about. Having left urbanization and Pan-Africanism out of his 6 regional zones, it's almost like they're plopping the Jewish state down there, hoping they annihilate each other. And I have a separate theory on that. But these are the same people, again, that are creating all of these Gladio units that are going to affect fascists as their destination. And so who's to say? And they're creating the Muslim terror cells. So you can definitely see, based on what their mindset is, these are the people that drafted the Balfour Agreement. These are the people that created the League of Nations, that created the Jewish state. That's why it's so important that we understand, especially what's going on right now, where all of this came from and what those people's mindsets were when they created it. They could very logically, reading their own words, have set up the very dynamic on purpose that we're currently seeing in order to mask, manipulate all of us into the long term fascist New World Order, because it is designed to create chaos forever. Chaos begets control. We have learned that. We have to start recognizing patterns. And that's why when I read this book, I was like, we've got to understand the mentality of these people when they did what they did in order for us to be able to undo it. He also voices an objection to the choice of Palestine, saying that it's too small. Now, keep in mind, this is the Balfour Agreement, which predated World War II. He says that it is too small to shelter the Jews, and uses these are an exact quote: the problem of 6 million unassimilated Jews in the East is the most serious problem, unquote. So, where did he get that number 6 million? And I find it completely odd that that's the number that has been used throughout history as to the number that needs assimilated into Israel if 6 million of them, and I'm not suggesting the Holocaust didn't happen, don't get my words. I just think it's odd that he uses the word 6 million, and 6 million is the same number that we've been told were massacred. So if 6 million was massacred, where did all of the people that immigrated to Israel come from? And I know they come from other places other than East European, but I just find it odd that that's the number this guy used before World War II even happened. Richard goes on basically to predict the rise of anti Semitism that will create a forced mass exodus of unassimilated Jews, again using the word 6 million, having to be relocated, and goes on to state that Palestine is not big enough. He proposes the Portuguese colony of Angola, but makes it clear that all of these people believe that the Jews and the Africans were in similar predicaments and have to be segregated from the rest of the world. That's the point I think we need to drive home. In 1903, Joseph Chamberlain offered British support to a guy by the name of Theodore Herzl in the form of giving the Zionist organization basically what is today Kenya as a Jewish homeland. So back as far as 1903, they're talking about delivering a segregated geographical location to round up all the Jews and put them there. Shifting gears to the incorporation of the international fascism into actually the transition from using the word international fascism into the pan-European, you get to a guy that we all know very well. I'll butcher his name. He's Hitler's central banker, Hamilmar Slat. It's Hjalmar. His last name is Schacht. Schlatt. He was the guy that was behind setting up the Bank of International Settlements. And if you recall, the Bank of International Settlements was supposedly set up to handle the debt from World War One. But as soon as he went around and did his tour of speaking to set it up, and everybody agreed they were going to set it up, the U.S. did not initially enter into the Bank of International Settlement. It has subsequently done so. But when it was set up to be the banker for all central bankers. Now, if your goal is to set up a new world order and you want to, you're going to have a bank to facilitate all the rest of the banking, right? So they're busy behind the scenes using these world wars as justification to set up the infrastructure for the New World Order. And that point I can't make emphatic enough, because as soon as the Bank of International Settlement was set up, all the countries that was owed war reparations forgave the war reparations. So there was absolutely no reason to keep the Bank of International Settlements, because the whole reason we were given to set it up was to facilitate the reparation payments. And then they forgave them all. But they didn't close the bank. So now the Bank of International Settlements is the foundation for world banking. The World Bank is kind of like their retail arm of the Bank of International Settlements, because you have to have the central bank and then basically their front to the world, which is the World Bank. Again, all of this set up while we're, in the middle of warfare as the answer. So it's no surprise that this guy, the banker, Slat, I hate German names. Actually, all these foreign names are a big obstacle for me. So he's definitely on board with the whole international fascist movement. So together they tried to convince Hitler to get on board. His central banker did. And of course, he's talking to Mussolini, and you've got the people, the Mitford family talking to Hitler through unity. You've got all these people. Hitler doesn't want to have anything to do with it. During this period, all of the same members, the Cecil Rhodes Round Table people, the Fabian Society people, all the New York bankers are all working together. This includes the Warburgs from Germany to engineer the financial order to bring about the New World Government. And I just wanted to take a second to go over a couple of these players just by name. I won't spend a lot of time on them. They're on page 113 if you have the book. It goes over the people like Herbert Hoover, who was the president during this time, 1929 to 1933. They orchestrated the Great Depression and the stock market crash to create the instability. He then blames all of that on Mexicans, and the Mexican economy for creating our depression, not like it was the central bankers or anything. And for those of you who are interested, it definitely was the central bankers. Frank Kellogg, who was served a tour as the Secretary of State. Kellogg was one of the few Republicans who supported the eliminating of national sovereignty in favor of ratifying the League of Nations. Another fascist. Owen Young, he's the guy that founded RCA, which was a subsidiary of General Electric. He also, through patent agreements, worked with GE, Westinghouse, AT&T, and the United Fruit Company, which was a Rockefeller entity that created all the instability in Guatemala later. He also was appointed to the board of the Rockefeller Foundation. It was his plan that imposed the reparations on World War I that ended up with the creation of the Bank of International Settlements. Bernard Barak, he's of the International Rubber Company. He's the guy that was in bed with Germany and basically delayed the rubber production for us, while at the same time ensuring that Hitler had all he needed. He was partners with John D. Rockefeller, George Foster Peabody. He had the reputation as the lone wolf on Wall Street. He gave advice to Woodrow Wilson. He was on the War Industries Board. Walter Lippmann was another one, American writer and reporter. He was friends with Colonel Edward Mandell House, who's also on the list, and was an advisor to Woodrow Wilson. And then we get to House, who basically acted as an executive agent. That guy's I don't. He should have been hung for treason. Um, General Tas- Tasker Bliss. What a name. He was a chief of staff of the Army under Woodrow Wilson. Hamilton Fish Armstrong. We read about him. He became the editor of the Foreign Affairs magazine, which was part of the Council of Foreign Relations. Um, he also was very supportive of the Balfour Agreement. Thomas Lamont, partners with J.P. Morgan, Council of Foreign Relations. So these are all of the guys that of this. Justice Charles Evan Hughes, who was the 11th Chief Justice of the United States. Um, yeah, he was the last one. Interestingly enough, um, he was he was part of proposing all of the New Deal legislation that Roosevelt would later try to pass, all of which, much of which, got struck down by the Supreme Court as unconstitutional. That's the irony of all ironies. Okay, so it's no coincidence that this very group that Richard adores among the U.S. participants are the same group that worked diligently to destroy the viability of the U.S. versus via the Federal Reserve, the income tax. Richard would go on to write the use of mass hypnotism for propaganda purposes is the most successful at times of crises. So this could be tattooed and used every day. This is their fascist approach to everything. Let me read that again. The use of mass hypnotism for propaganda purposes is the most successful at times of crises. So, what will you always have? A crisis. And you create the crisis to control people. Churchill would go on to write an article labeled The United States of Europe. In it, he says, quote, let the British Empire, excluded in Richard's plan, realize its own world and spread ideal, even show the mass of Europe, once united, once federalized or partially federalized, be the conscience of Europe with its African and Asian possessions and plantations would constitute an orgasm beyond compare. So again, here's Churchill subjugating the plantations of Africa and Asia, because the British Empire, as we talked about yesterday, has their East Indies and their West Indies, and they use them as slave plantations. So Churchill is just advocating that Europe basically does the exact same thing with Africa. Churchill goes on to say that we belong to no single continent, but all of them, not to one hemisphere, but to both, as well as the New World. While Richard was touring the U.S. giving speeches, he met John Foster Dulles. The two of them found they had much in common and were in agreement with the pan-European idea, because of course he would be. And of course, this is before John Foster Dulles ends up being the Secretary of State. That's scary. Churchill would follow with a speech calling, hold on, I had a glitch on my computer, a speech calling for a global court, a global police force, and a global army to prevent future wars and to secure world peace. Now, let's stop here for just a second. A global court, which they have, a global police force, which I believe Operation Gladio gave them, and a global army, which is what NATO gave them. If they are, let's see, he's also quoted as saying the United Nations will evolve into the best method ever for stopping wars. How'd that work out? Because we're eliminating wars is not what they were all about, and we know that. Um, that's where we're going to conclude for today. Um, so basically, we're getting the idealism, if you will, the thought process that framed the actual creation of the Gladio units, and how the fact that this need for them to set up a global court, a global police force, and a global army um, was implemented, and what aspects the Operation Gladio played in that implementation. So, yeah, thanks, Julie, for capturing that. That is, that to me is just, it kind of sums up nicely everything that we just went through, because I just think it's critical that we understand where all of this came from and how deeply it's embedded in all of the different aspects. Because when Trump gets up on stage and he starts criticizing NATO, well, what we learned yesterday is the first 16 years of NATO was Nazis. We spent almost 2 decades being under the rule of Nazis under the guise of NATO. Are you freaking kidding me? And everybody that set up every one of these infrastructures were either Nazis or fascist. That's where all of this shit comes from. So it just blows my mind when we find out how large this, and it makes you appreciate Trump even more. Trump knows all of this, and he still walked into the lion's den. This is what everybody needs to understand. So I'm going to ask y'all to do me a favor. If you haven't already followed us on Rumble, and give us the thumbs up, because that brings all of the algorithms, I guess. I just learned this last night. My daughter was telling me that. It gets this viewed by more people, because I think we absolutely have to understand how ginormous this ball was of yarn, like evil yarn, and it makes us appreciate so much more all of the efforts of General Flynn, of Trump, Kash Patel, and all of these warriors that have entered into the lion's den to save all of us. So I'm going to close on that. Thank you, American Gorilla. I really appreciate y'all being here more than you will ever know. Please share this as widely as you can. Give us a follow, give us a thumbs up, so we can get this into as many people's inbox as we can. God bless you all. I'm going to go have a birthday party, and I will see you on Thursday. We're not going to do one tomorrow. Really appreciate you being here.